So, John, the first thing I wanted to talk about was tell me about your story leading up to the book, right? You didn't just wake up one day and write the book. There's a story behind that, I have to believe.
Yeah,
Is that
totally.
the case?
Totally. It's a great question. Yeah, thanks for asking it. I do have to tell you, the book a little bit came out of nowhere in the sense, it's a big thing to do. And I think a few things sort of contributed. Honestly, I think the most important thing is I biked across the country. Crazy enough. I was in college and I just got done with my college. And for some reason, like, man, I really want to, I'm from Kansas City, Missouri, very proud to be American. I have a very strong sense of what it likes to be American. My mom lived abroad. My aunt lived abroad. They can tell you, there's a lot of things that are very special about living here. And I took this trip. I took 54 days. I biked across the country. And I know it sounds really crazy, but I let all these Americans, and it was just amazing. Like the hospitality people had, the beauty of the country. And I spent some time in other places in the world, and it just felt really different when you kind of get off the beaten path. Just the care, and I think open-mindedness and generosity that I sort of experienced, and it just inspired me. I was like, God, I fell in love and with the country. And for my studies, I'd done some history, I'd done economics, institutional economics, and then after all of that, I worked in management consulting and did a lot of work with like big institutions, figuring out like why is this working or why is this not working. And for some reason, at the end of that, this is 2010, 2011. So the Republicans had taken the House in 2010, and we're figuring out where we want to go as a country. And I just felt really inspired. I said, God, I really want to dig into this, because I felt like the federal government wasn't working very well. Like in all of my studies, you would read about these programs and they sounded really good, and you would do all this research, and then at the very end, you're like, oh wait, they didn't actually work. Over and over, it was really crazy. And it was like, the professor was been 90% talking about the idea and how cool it could be. And then you look at the results and it's like, they're not good. And it was great Groundhog Day. Right. And I was just like, what is going on here? Why do I keep seeing, like, I can't find, and I've done some shows with other people who don't agree with me. And I always say, I said, look back the last 50 years, it's 2022. Go back to 1972 to today. Can you find 3 federal programs that you think have exceeded your expectations or others? And you'd be shocked how often it's just silent. They can't think of one. I'm like, what other company, right, could you think of that in 50 years has not exceeded your expectation one freaking time, right? So I just was like, I really want to figure out what's going on here, because the federal government just keeps growing. And I'm like, the results are so bad. Like, why is that? Why do we keep having to grow? Like, where do we start from as a country? How did we get here? And I was reading a bunch of books, and I wasn't finding anything that I thought did a nice job of putting it all together. So at some point I had the crazy idea, and it was legitimately crazy. And I talked to some other people and said, hey, well, maybe you should write a book about it. And I talked to some people at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. It's kind of a center-right, really, really thoughtful think tank. And they said, look, go for it. You seem really passionate about it. You're willing to put in the time. And I decided to dedicate the next 2.5, 3 years of my life to writing this book.
That's incredible. It is amazing. You go to some places and you really will find these amazing patriotic people. Not so much where I'm at. You left California, right? You ended up in California at one point, and you're one of those Californians, not really, because you were a transplant there. Yeah. But you're one of those evil Californians that trying to take over and liberalize Texas. Not so much, I guess, in your case.
Not so much. Well, what I will tell you is, it's funny because I was at an event at some point, and they basically found that the people who are former Californians in Texas, at least based on some surveys, tend to vote more Republican than local Texans, actually. And the reason, and I've seen this because if I look at my friends, the people who move here, there's a little bit of a self-selection going on, right? So it's the people who want to get out of California are the ones who move to Texas.
Yeah,
I think the people that need to be worried are the people like Colorado.
Right, I would agree.
But Texas is not changing.
So you said God earlier. Are you a religious person?
I'm not. I wouldn't say. I mean, I'm not current. I would say I'm open to it. I'm not currently active, but I'm certainly open to it, and I think sort of aligned that way. But I'd say I'm more agnostic in
Gotcha.
terms of my personal views. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just curious. And so you talked a little bit about your corporate path. Well, first of all, you're biking across the country. Let's talk about that a second, because that's no small task.
Yeah.
Are you a pretty physical guy generally still?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. A lot of weightlifting, running, getting into jujitsu a little bit. So kind of mixing it up a little bit.
Do you read a lot? And you wrote a book. Do you read a lot?
I do. I read a lot.
So part of the reason I bring this up is, you see these patterns, and, people, I like to talk about the path to success, and it really comes down to these basic habits, really: reading, creating, speaking, interacting with people, networking, taking care of yourself. So it's interesting that you do that too. So, I guess, well, let's stick with your background a little bit and the story leading up to the book a little bit, and then we can get into the book a little bit more. So you bike across the country, you're inspired by what you see, which is really motivating to me. And that kind of begins this journey, but you got to work like everybody else. You have a career and things like that. And there's not a lot of money to be made in books, as you're probably finding, right? So you have this other career path. You said you've been involved with some big corporations. I guess the one that stood out to me was the Gates Foundation. Can you speak to what your involvement there was?
Yeah, I can. So what I basically do is a lot of strategic planning. And I think that's kind of why the book was such a good fit for me, because I'm not a historian. And it's like, I don't think we should always let the historians write history, because it's like they've never run anything, right? They don't have any sense of how things actually work in the real world. And I have some sense, because I get hired to go into real companies and figure out what is going on, what's working, what's not, and how do we double down in the areas that's working and get out of the areas that isn't working. And that's kind of what I do.
You mean like results oriented kind of nonsense, right?
Totally. Exactly. So at the Gates Foundation, we did a lot of strategic planning. So we were working with their US program, which spends about $500 million a year in the United States. Does a lot of really good work, actually, kind of helping with training programs and how do we get more kids into graduate from high school and into college and vocational schools. So it's a lot of really good stuff. And we did a 3-month strategy and visioning project with them.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
And is it the work that you're doing, is it mostly analytical, or is a lot of technology involved? I'm just curious the background of it.
It's a lot of combination. It's a lot of I'd say like complex problem solving, like combination of qualitative and quantitative. Like, let's get some data, let's do like read, and then kind of figure out, okay, what's the conclusion? Like, where do we want to focus? What should we do? What should we not do? So kind of like classic type strategy questions, right? Where should we play? What's our winning aspiration? How do we win? Those kinds of questions.
So the bottom line is, you grew up here in America, and you got a chance to travel around the country, and you felt a special connection. I've been around the world, not that it matters. And so I've been to a few different places along the way of that journey. And I felt the same way. There's just definitely a special people here, a special place here, and we really do need to preserve it. So, you got that, and then you get into the corporate world, and you're in this, really high level, highly analytical, results based, constant, how do we improve, right? How do we do this better? I think that's a good thing. It used to be a good thing. I don't know anymore. I get confused. Right. But you're looking around and you're saying, the country that I love, the people that I admire, and we're not being governed very well, in essence. Would that be a fair statement?
I think it's a fair statement.
So
it's probably an understatement.
Fair enough. So I would agree, by the way. I ask, what kind of progress? My big question is, how do you is this the progress that you wanted? Mm-hmm. How are we progressing? I'm not seeing that. All the different problems we're having. And and there's so many, I have a good friend of mine, also has a radio show here outside of Philadelphia. And he says, the definition of insanity is repeating the same thing, expecting a different outcome. And I think both parties politically, we'll get to that, I guess, are guilty of some of that, but specifically government. You're right. There's so many things that you can point to say, not only have the results not satisfied anything remotely an actual goal that would be worthy, but they're producing the opposite of the intended effect in many cases. I think to your question, if you ask me, name one federal institution I could be proud of, and you said it a little differently. What did you say? What was
Program.
the exact? Or
federal program.
Okay. Well, I was going to say the military, but I guess that's not really what you're speaking to when you say that.
No, but I mean, I think you're right that they run pretty well. I think the federal courts run pretty well. And guess what? Those are in the Constitution.
Yeah, right.
So we're supposed to have those. There's really no debate about that. It's everything else.
Indeed. So, all right. So you're looking at things, you're like, hey, there's a better way of doing this, right? And you wanted to speak to that. And the way that you chose to speak to it was to write a book, right? So what are you hoping that the outcome of writing this book is? What was your goal in writing it?
I think, one of the things is when you have a book, you can really think big, right? Because I was like, well, I could write some articles, but I don't think that I could really bite off a big idea. And so, what I'm trying to do in the book is I really think we've lost our way. And by the way, I didn't know this until I did all the research, but after I did all the research, I really think we've lost our way. And I think we had a very thoughtful and effective way to think about politics at the beginning of our country. I mean, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. I mean, these are world-class figures that were sitting around tables, John Adams, that were debating this for decades. And they came up with our Constitution as a group, right? And they set up the government. And they debated amongst themselves, but on a lot of stuff they agreed. And people forget that. We veered away. We veered away in a very, very big way. And in some ways I'm sympathetic, and in some ways I'm not. But the bottom line is we've really changed the role of the federal government has massively changed. And we've really moved away from the values that I think underpinned it. That's just descriptively what happened. When I do the thinking and I research this and I really dig into the details of it, we're always asking, well, where do we go next? Right? Where do we go next? And that's just how human beings work, right? We're always thinking a little bit about the future. And if I sit back and really think about that question, I think we need to go back to rediscover, hence the name of the book, Rediscover Republicanism, to rediscover what made the values of that our country had and how we looked at politics, and then reapply it to where we are now. Because we've moved so far away, it actually will be pretty different. It's to actually reapply them. And I think they're, quite frankly, exactly what we need to go do.
I think an important part of that, I agree with you 100%. And I think an important part, it creates an incredible opportunity right now. It really does. When you combine the technology that we have available, the knowledge that we have available, the infrastructure that we have available, and you combine that with a proper approach to government, and the results could be phenomenal. And there's places that have proven that on a scale. I'll tell you one thing that you did with this, John. I don't know if you realize that I think is really important to mention, is that this book is now a historical document, and you've memorialized some thoughts with this that are contrary to a lot of textbook thinking, right? So one of those is you believe in a very conservative, if I'm reading this right, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, very conservative perspective on states' rights, would you say?
Yes.
Why do you think that's so important?
Well, there's a number of reasons. There's the historical reason, the constitutional reason, and then there's the practical reason. When the country was started, and I think this is really important. Some people don't think this matters, but I think it matters. So I'll start with this. When the country was started, the federal government had very few limited responsibilities that were listed in the Constitution. And the proof's in the pudding. So if you look at, and I talk about this in the book, the percentage of money, the gross domestic product that the federal government spent of the total, it was around 2%, right? Including the military, right? Because we didn't need a really big one back in those days. So 2% to do everything. And there was no taxes, no regulations, most American citizens never even met a federal official other than the person that they elected to go to Congress. And people lived their lives. But here's what's really interesting. That didn't mean that we didn't have politics in our country. That didn't mean that we didn't do things at the domestic level. We did. State governments did a lot. And state governments could have, I mean, the remit of state governments is wider now than any government today, because the Bill of Rights, actually, this is the funny thing, the Bill of Rights did not apply against the state governments. And people don't know this, but the Bill of Rights, if you read it, it says Congress shall make no law. Amendment number 1, Congress shall make no law. So it didn't say the state governments couldn't do it. So states would restrict speech. States would fund religious establishments. This is actually true. So the reason for that was because the founders wanted people to be able to argue about these issues, but at a local level with people that had somewhat shared values, not as a country of 350 million people, or at that time, I think it was 15 million, 20 million. So we wanted to be able to have these, what we call laboratories of democracy. Louis Brandeis said this, a Supreme Court justice in the early 20th century. Laboratories of democracy to let people express their values, right? And have those enforced in the domestic realm. So it was a very simple setup. Like the federal government largely is basic rules in the country, court system, Bill of Rights, postal service, military, and then outside, full responsibility, United States military, State Department, etc. That was the job. And then the states would take care of most things. And the states spent more money, interestingly, than the federal government. It was not even close from the beginning of the Constitution, 1789, all the way through the Civil War. So the state governments were doing, and it makes sense. You can meet, it's not hard to meet your local state representative. It's not hard to meet your local state senator. These are very valuable people.
People that you knew.
People that you knew, and you can know today. And so, so that's the historical reason. Here's the practical reason. There's 50 of them. And a lot of the stuff that this is basic science, right? I mean, it's funny because people are just like, practicality. You're trying to solve things like poverty. You're trying to figure out things like infrastructure, prison recidivism. Like, these are not simple problems, right? These are not. I don't think anyone's ever solved them in human history, right? Homelessness. So the idea that like the federal government is going to figure this out and then deploy it nationwide, like show me the evidence for that. What does work is having 50 different governments try different things. Pennsylvania can try something, Utah can try something, Texas, and then we copy what works and we get rid of what doesn't.
And maybe the same thing doesn't work in every place.
And the same thing might not even work. That's a great point.
Yeah.
So I think there are practical reasons, and you think about what's going to help someone get out of poverty, what's going to help someone transition out of prison. Social networks, support, someone calling you. It's not a form. It's not a bureaucrat, right? That's why these things don't work. These are human problems. So the idea the federal government could solve, it's just so crazy to me. And I know we keep going down this path and maybe, we just have to kind of, deal with it. But I do hope at some point as a country, we come to our senses and we just say, here's the thing that I think we have to do as conservatives. The thing that I think we get caught in, the thing that I think we do, that I think doesn't do a service, is we get caught in the argument of this doesn't matter. Like the federal government shouldn't help impoverish people or whatever. And you start saying, oh, we want to help poor people and you don't. That's a tough argument to win. I think it's much better to say, no, we agree on that. This country's helped indigent people since the 1600s. I can show you the historical record. What's new is the federal government leading the way. That's what's not working. So what I'm saying is, let's go back to the other stuff that actually worked. State governments, churches, associations taking the lead and letting go of this crazy idea that the federal government has a panacea for these problems. It doesn't.
What I was going to say about all that, John, a couple of things on the states' rights, just to put some math to what you're saying. You know, you talked about 2% in the federal government. And I haven't updated this in a little while, so you could fact check this, but currently we pay $18,000 per year in taxes for every man, woman, and child in this country. Half of that money goes to the federal government. And when you look at what the federal government does compared even today to what the state and local governments do, what do state and local governments do? Almost all the roads, you got a few federal highways, but almost all of the roads, any community hospitals for the most part, other than VA hospitals, almost all of the police, almost all of the teachers, many local state and local welfare programs still exist today. Who do you think is providing foster care and these localized services? All of the courts. Of course, we have a federal court system, but your divorce, your domestic disputes, all these things are solved at the local level. All these things that these local, state and local governments are tasked with doing. And what does the federal government do? The military. And I guess NASA, I haven't heard anything from NASA in, I think, 30 years now. So what are they doing? To your point, there's no innovation, there's no nothing. So that's some math on it. And, you know, I think to your point too, in terms of it's an unfair setup to expect that somebody, you know, if you're on the West Coast, 3,000 miles away, is going to understand the people, the problem, and the solutions that you have locally. It's a ridiculous idea. And the net result of what's happened, and it's a result of, I always forget, it's the 16th Amendment, the Income Tax Amendment. And when that was enacted, our freedom evaporated, right? It says that the government has the power to tax income, more or less, period. That's not exact, but there's no limit on it. How we ever have a constitutional amendment that allowed unlimited federal income tax? When that was created, we created this albatross that we have with us today. And people are smothering under it. The tax burden, you say, well, I don't pay 18, you know, poor people, I don't pay any federal income tax, but it's still baked into the cost of everything. And so not only have you lost the competitiveness that you talked about, where you're dealing with a problem of homelessness, and you know what, local government is a specialty of mine. And as much as you're correct that these problems have never been solved and they likely never will be, we do have a drug epidemic. We have a mental health crisis in this country. So these things are very difficult and more or less unsolvable. At the same time, they're completely manageable. And I know his name in some circles is kind of mud right now, but Rudy Giuliani proved this in New York. Mayor Rizzo in Philadelphia. Now, these people, of course, are vilified now as racist and things like that. And maybe that's true, but maybe we ought to look at the things that allowed them to govern these cities without rampant crime. But what's happened, so you not only has the federal government overtaken these things where you've lost the competitiveness that naturally produces positive outcomes that we see in capitalism, but the federal government is consuming such massive resources that the state and local government, they can't take anymore. The people are being taxed to death and they're trying to compete with the federal government. If all that's not enough, we're $30 trillion in debt, which is about, put that number in perspective, about $80,000 for every man, woman, and child in the country. I mean, what more evidence do you need that this federal system has failed? And why, how, I mean, I think, you know, I don't know if you get into this in your consulting, but, you know, what do you say to people that even in the face of plain evidence that don't want to make a change? Insanity, I guess. What else can you call it?
Yeah. I mean, they're just very deep-seated disagreements, you know, or an argument that has yet to be won. I mean, if you look at it the other way, it's like, you just have to keep making the argument.
Indeed. So, you had this great story leading up to the book. You hunker down, you write the book. It's incredible research. Like I said, this is a historical document at this point. Why don't you use, I don't want you to talk through exactly because we want people to read the book. I think get the details of it.
Let's talk as much as we want.
What's it about? You tell me what it's about. We talked about states' rights. We talked about federal government broadly, but what's the book about?
So there's basically 3 parts to the book. And I think each part does something different that's important. And I think new. The first part is really called the origins section. It's basically saying, like, when we started the country, what did they believe, and how did we sort of get up to the beginning of what we're doing now, right? Not the full story, but from the beginning, which is basically the New Deal with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So we talk about we talk about the founders, right, and what did they believe, and that was right. There's a lot of interesting things to say there. Then I talk about, and I think this is something that's actually new. I don't think there's any book that I've read or know about. And I talked to some Pulitzer Prize winners about this, some historians that are like quite well regarded. Gordon Wood among them. He's a really well regarded historian. And I talked to him, and he said, I don't think anyone's written this what you've pointed out here, which is what I call these three really big contributing factors that I think we probably needed all three of them to kind of set us up for where we are now. Which was the Civil War, European ideas, which was we basically adopted all these, right? We escaped from Europe, created a new country, and then we send all our people over to Europe, and then they come back with these ideas. So European ideas, statist European ideas, and then American progressivism. And I really think you needed all three to get to where we are today, because the old model was pretty stable other than the Civil War. Right. And of course, slavery was the institution that sat below the Civil War. That was like the precipitating factor. And the Civil War is what occurred as a response to that disagreement among the states about that institution. So, but the states after the Civil War, and actually, do you mind if I go into each of the three just real quick?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I don't know how much your audience is going to enjoy what level of detail here. But if we take the Civil War, what happened is up to the Civil War, we had the state governments were really driving domestic political life. They were in charge of everything that affected the average citizen, really. I mean, in terms of politics. After the Civil War, that really changed. And there's a number of things that you can kind of point to. We established the Internal Revenue Service. That didn't exist until the Civil War, and it never went away, right? The federal government started printing money. I mean, okay, this is a great example of how decentralized we were. Before the Civil War, we didn't even have a federal currency. State governments and local banks would print local money. Now, that may not have been the greatest thing for economic growth, but it's a great example of how decentralized we were. We actually let state governments be in charge of our currency. After the Civil War, obviously the federal government took over banking regulation, and got a bunch of new rights, of things that the responsibilities that the government got to enforce. But what's really interesting is they really didn't do very much. They didn't actually use these powers. So that was really interesting when I was doing the research. So this is really interesting. The federal government after the Civil War has a bunch of power, but it's not really doing anything, right? And I'll give you a really interesting example. The Civil War, after the Civil War, Union veterans, unsurprisingly, it was a brutal war. And I know you know this, Chris, we lost more people in the Civil War than we lost through like Vietnam.
Yeah.
And we only had 30 million people. I mean, it's like 700 or 800,000 deaths in a country of 30 million.
Right.
I mean, it was a bloodbath. I mean, I can't even imagine. So we have a lot of people coming out of that are maimed and killed, etc. So unsurprisingly, there was a desire to help people who were hurt in the war. What's really interesting is we have Civil War pensions. Yep. Sounds like Social Security. Mm-hmm. Civil War disability programs make sense. They got their arm blown off in Antietam, right? Probably want to get them something to help them out. So we have disabilities. We have supports for if they die. So they have, that's another Social Security program. So you basically in 1875, 1880, you have the full thing that we see today. But what's really interesting is they didn't expand it. That's so fascinating because you're like, so we totally had the idea. We totally had the capabilities. So then you're like, well, why didn't they do that? And the reason was, it's very simple. People thought the veterans had earned it because they fought in a war. It's like, you don't earn anything. You're just a citizen. Why should the whole government be paying you, right, for these things? You should be taking care of yourself. So they basically didn't even have the idea to do it. That's where the European ideas come in. So the first university in the United States was Yale. I think it was 1861 was our first PhD granting university. So to get a PhD, these are the people that teach our classes at college, right? So this is a very important group of people. You may not like them, I don't like a lot of what they had to say because I think they're very biased, but they are the people teaching in our schools, right? And that was true at the time. So what they believe really matters. until 1861, you had to go to Europe to get a PhD and teach at college. And even after up until 1900, almost half would go, right? Even though we had some institutions that had PhD programs, half of American PhDs were going to Europe. They would go to Europe and they would come back. Well, while they were in Europe, they learned a lot about Europe. And you're right. And Europe at that time was very statist, extremely. You have monarchs, right? You have actually, ironically, you have a lot of monarchies when they were going over there in the 1800s. And the monarchs were they want the government to have a lot of power because they could have a lot of power. This is what we revolted against, by the way. People don't remember this. We revolted against this system. So we sent these kings over, we sent these people to the kingdom, and they learn about, and they learn about all these statist ideas, and they come back. And Woodrow Wilson's a really great example of this. Woodrow Wilson went to Johns Hopkins, which was a university founded with a political science department. All of the professors at the time had gone to Europe to study, came back, and taught Wilson from all of these European ideas. He was in seminars filled with books in German and French, right, about politics from a European point of view. And they were like the state. I'll give you a quote. A German philosopher named Hegel had this quote about the state is the march of God in the world, right? And this is a quote that Wilson would refer to, right? So you're putting the state up on this very high pedestal, not the individual citizen, the government.
Right.
And so
big change,
huge change, at least for the professors. That's how you get to American progressivism, which that's where you get into politics, right? And Woodrow Wilson is a key. And Woodrow Wilson's a character I follow a lot in the book, which is basically took these European ideas and customized them for an American audience. And they said, all right, how do we make these popular? Because in Germany, they just have a king, right? He doesn't care what the people think. We have to actually sell this stuff. We have to get people to vote for it. Mm-hmm. And they figured it out over 20 or 30 years. It's like, we're going to give you free stuff. We're going to regulate things you don't like, right? We're going to make people that you don't like, we're going to stop them from doing things to you. So the federal government will protect you, right? And so they convinced enough people. Woodrow Wilson obviously won the election of 1912 and then 1916. And so he was kind of the first and really last really great American progressive. You have Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, but I don't think he really did as much. And so the first part of the book is kind of getting us all the way up to the New Deal. And then you have the New Deal, that's when, bar the door, right? Katie barred the door. It really, really, really changed. And that's the world we're living in today.
It really did start at that time. I've talked about this too. And that's why I was really encouraged. The story that you laid out for the most part is a story I knew and understood. And but your detail of it and the documentation of it, it's not an easy read, to be fair.
No, please.
It took me a bit to chisel through that, but it was really worth it. Right. So you get to the New Deal, and you name some of the things, and you go, I've spoke about it broadly, leading up, the confiscation of gold, the adoption of the 16th Amendment. You pointed to it. I've argued many times the probably purposeful crashing of the stock market to initiate this process. Mm-hmm. And then what was it in the 70s, I guess, or the 60s, the massive expansion of these social welfare programs. Yes. And here we are today, and they've run out of places to throw money, right? It's just gotten bizarre how out of control it's gotten. Yeah. You speak to the the monarchy, and there's a little, we were talking about videos, before we started recording, there's a little video on God in politics. I would say simply like this: people who care versus people who don't care. And people who aren't connected with the people generally don't care. And that's why kings, they don't have to care. So there's no need to care. They don't have to rely on the people. They just order them around like peasants. And what we've created for ourselves, at least for 50% of our government resources, is basically a multi-head monarchy of 500-600 people between Congress, the executive branch, and the Supreme Court. And it's horrible. It would actually be better if we just had a king, because at least we would know who to blame. With the 600 of them arguing and bickering, all it's led to is constant fighting, which I think is really your point in the book, to say, we've tested this federalist system, right, which was sold to us under the guise that a big, powerful federal government was needed to secure peace in the world. And that hasn't happened either, despite all the spending in that.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about the state currencies, and it's really hard to predict. In terms of predictions, in 2006, I thought we were done. I looked at all the signs. I was going down to Washington, D.C., listening to economists. The business I was involved in was just very, market sensitive, and they were predicting a soft landing. I was predicting Armageddon, and neither was right, quite frankly. Right. So this time around, I look at what's going on, and I'm not making any predictions, but I will say this. The problems that I see now financially, or let alone the social and government problems, are 10 times worse than what we saw in 2006. And I don't know if it's an if. I think most people would say when the currency crashes, because fiat money never survives indefinitely. The answer to that is going to be a return to local currencies by default. And I can't believe there was a time not too long ago where there was preparations for that. There was, manuals within government that if we have to go back to a localized currency, and maybe they exist in the basement somewhere, but you don't hear that type of thing talked about too much. If anything, it seems to be more talk about further expansion of the federal government. But I like that you've laid out the history, you've explained the why. And then you get to the point at the end, which is the rediscovering republicanism. Do you want to speak to that, or you want to say read the book to get it?
No, we can totally let's speak about it. I'd love people to buy the book, Rediscovering Republicanism, by the way, on Amazon. I don't know, Chris, I guess I should repeat that a few times. But let's talk about it. What I'm most excited about is people learning about these ideas and having conversation and using this as an opportunity to think. So I would love to sell books, but that's not my primary goal. So the third section of the book is really, so the first section of the book is origins, which we were talking about before. The second section of the book, which is probably the hardest to read, but I think was really important, is kind of understanding what went wrong, right? So we get it to the New Deal, and I'll quickly kind of itemize it, right? We have Social Security, which is headed towards insolvency, right? So that's going to be a problem we got to figure out. Medicare is in probably worse shape. Our poverty rate really hasn't gone down since the federal government got involved 50 years ago, right? It was at 60% in 1900. It went down to 11% in 1973, and it's really been there for the last 50 years. 1973 was the first recession after the federal government got involved with social welfare programs. I don't think that's a coincidence, right? Because if you start paying people to not make money, more people won't make money. It's just common sense. Now, I'm not saying you don't want to be care, but you got to understand basic incentives. So that happened, right? We started Amtrak. We still had the Postal Service, right? Amtrak has not made money since its existence in 1971 or 73. I don't know what the technical date is. It's lost money every single year. So, and that's a great example. Like the federal government got involved in a new area, and what's the results, right? So we're kind of seeing the same thing over and over and over again, right? So that's part 2 of the book, and I like that we jumped to part 3. So what do we go do, right? There's lots of things in the world that aren't great that you just have to accept. The world's not perfect. At least that's my belief. It's just not. Human beings aren't perfect. We're works in progress, indefinite works in progress. That doesn't mean things can't get better. So what do we do? What do we do? And what I basically say is, look, we're so far off the ranch at this point in terms of where we started. We had to go back to first principles. We just have to go back, right? And actually do some thinking and reflecting. If you go back to the very beginning of the country and you figure out what were the values that the founders really prioritized when they were starting the country, 3 really jump out. One is the individual citizen, right? This country, unlike a lot of countries, we the people, as individuals and then as a group, we the people are the owners of this country, not a king. And that was a really big freaking deal, because when they made the Declaration of Independence in the Constitution, we say we the people over and over again. That's because it's our country. It's not the king's country. That's why they're our representatives, right? Technically speaking, when we elect someone, we are designating them as a representative for a period of time to go legislate, and then they return to the people when their work is completed, right? We give them a little bit of power, they get exercised, and they come back into the body politic, which is us. So that's why we have a Bill of Rights, right? We hold all political power in this country. And Americans really need to realize this. The government fundamentally, if you look at the political theory of the United States, holds nothing. We hold everything. We delegate it, whatever we choose, to the government through the Constitution. So when we started, the theory was, the belief, the recommendation of George Washington and Jefferson and Adams, all these people, they all agreed on this, that the individual citizen should maintain the vast majority of powers over their life. The vast majority. We want people to take care of themselves. I think we've gotten really far away from that. So that's value number one, is let's go back to basics and reapply that. Value two, which we were talking about before, is what I call renewed federalism, right? We've got to empower our state governments more. The story here, Chris, and people don't like to talk about it, but I just like to call it as I see it. The reality was slavery, and then after slavery, the Jim Crow rules discredited state governments. That's basically what happened, right? State governments propped up slavery and then also had Jim Crow. And that's just a historical fact. You can't really debate that. So as the states lost those battles, they lost power because they were on the wrong side of history on those issues. That, I think we hit a turning point for sure in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act, right? And the Civil Rights Act of 1964. State governments really haven't been doing anything along those lines. And there's been little things on the side, but I'm talking about like 99.9% of cases. They're not really doing that. So I'm basically saying we need to rehabilitate them, okay? Like, state governments are not inherently racist institutions. They're just governments. Like, that's like the federal government's not inherently not racist, as we've seen recently, right? So, because it can be racist too. So I'm basically saying that happened. That was terrible, right? It was the original sin of our country, in my opinion. No argument from that's my view. And state governments lost a lot of power. And 55 years have gone by, and we got to just say, hey, look, it's like any human being, right? Sometimes people do terrible things, and then 20 years later, they're a great person, right? And you're in prison for a certain amount of time, we let you out, and we give you another chance. So I think with our state governments, we got to say, look, these are really important institutions, and we've clipped their wings over and over and over again. You can't do this. You can't. I mean, the Department of Education, the federal government being involved in education. I mean, that's crazy. Really, we think they're going to solve education. So we got to start moving important stuff back to the states and let the states be at the center of American domestic life. And then the third value is civil society, which is all of us. What do we do outside politics? And when you look at people transforming their lives, right? Fundamental change you see in personal, that doesn't happen in politics. That happens in churches, that happens in religious groups, that happens in like really intensive development programs, right? I mean, there's a reason the Gates Foundation ended malaria, right? That wasn't the United States government that has 100 times more resources. And no one's surprised. No one's surprised that Elon Musk is the guy that's getting us to Mars. He's a private company. He's one person. You were just asking what's NASA been doing. I don't know. They've been burning our tax dollars, billions of dollars a year. And what's there to show for it? And you got this crazy guy, right, in California, now Texas, thank you, who's figured out without a lot of, with largely private money, how to get us to freaking Mars. So it's like, okay, well, that's a big problem. So the point there is, I think as American citizens, we have to stop saying, oh, there's a problem, and immediately say the federal government has to solve it. It's just, like you were saying, it's kind of insanity, right? It just doesn't work. And I wish that there was a magical creature in the sky that would just come down and solve all of our problems, but that's just not how it works in reality, in our human reality. And so civil society, and you look at the founding period, fire departments, libraries, infrastructure projects, all of these were done outside government. And the Americans were able to pull it off. We've really lost that. I think it's really hurt us.
What would be the amendment cutoff in your conversation? You know, what starting at what amendment would you repatriate back to the states, if I'm saying that correctly?
Yeah. I don't know if I would look at it on the amendment level, because those might be really hard to change. We adding other amendments is easier. I don't know if we need to change any amendments. I think what I'm talking about, I think we can do without, I mean, a constitutional amendment would be really helpful. I think the way that I'm thinking about your question is, you know, where would you
ask it to you differently, John? So you're basically saying, hey, rediscovering republicanism means providing protected classes for people with disabilities, right? And things like equal opportunity to home loans, right? You're saying, look, the new age of republicanism needs to take the core values that we started with, and add just a little bit to pick up where this expansion of federalism was allowed to take place on these social issues, and recapture those issues back at the state. Would that be fair?
I think largely that's fair. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good description. I mean, let's just be concrete. Education, social welfare programs for the poor, a lot of infrastructure projects, I think should go from the federal government back to the state governments.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I'll tell you the simple way to do that. Here's where I go on my rant a little bit that the audience loves. But look, the Department of Education is a joke. It ought to be called the Department of De-Education. You're saying provide the education at the state level. It already is. The Department of Education does not teach one child. All they're doing is consuming this money. And just to keep this very simple, I think that the simple solution is that the 16th Amendment, which allowed the federal government to tax all income to 100% if they choose, and they will, you know, they talk about defaulting on the debt. Well, nobody's talked to the creditors about that, you know, and by law, they can just continue to take money from us. So yeah, it's unconscionable to think that we take our hard-earned tax dollars, a portion of that, we're willing to contribute for public education. Everybody agrees on that. That's a popular issue. Even with the sky-high school taxes here, people still don't want to cut it. People are happy to contribute their fair share. Fair enough. All I'm saying is, why are we sending it up to Washington for them to come down and tell us that we need a third bathroom? It doesn't make any sense. And what they've done is, because they have to justify their existence, which is worthless. It's completely worthless. If there was a value to it for a limited period of time, there's another thing I believe with these programs, there should be an end date, including NASA for that matter, or at least a massive reduction. Why do we need it when it's been privatized? Why do we need that redundancy? It makes no sense at all. And so the government repatriating that money, I see as being key. Giving this, whether it's going to NASA, NASA's doing nothing, or Department of Education, which has taken a public education system that by and large, you could debate this a little bit, but did a pretty good job of teaching things like reading, writing, and arithmetic. And those were kind of essential to a basic education. Now, we don't even talk about those core competencies when we talk about education. We're talking about racism and gender issues. My daughter's 7 years old. She knows her gender and she's really convinced of it. If she has any questions, we'll deal with it at home. To think that we're going to spend our money and have them dictate back to us how we're supposed to raise our children. And, you know, this anti-Christian movement, which has really, you know, become to infringe on people's religious rights. And I want to make a point about that, just something I was thinking about while you were talking, which is really fascinating to be able to talk to you and listen. And I hope listening to this will be a good augment to the book, because it definitely is for me. But as you talked about slavery being the underlying issue for the Civil War, I wonder if abortion couldn't be the catalyst for a new civil war in this country. And I'll tell you, this is another issue that you're going to see an important test going on. And that is that those rights were put back to the states. And look at how the federal government is going, kicking and screaming, right? What a disgrace to the Supreme Court. Biden issuing executive orders running totally contrary to the Supreme Court ruling. The institution of federal government is imploding on itself. But the interesting thing about abortion is that I find quite frankly that among reasonable people, there's actually a lot of agreement on the issue of abortion. You know, if you say, are you pro-abortion or pro-life, like it's a black and white issue, you get these very black and white responses to that. But it's not a black and white issue at all. It's a very personal issue. And when you really get down and talk about it, I would say, and this is an area where I think I'm pretty well plugged in. I bet you 80% of the people are in agreement that there are reasons for legitimate abortions. Not everybody's going to agree with that, and I understand that too. But most people agree with that. But I'll tell you what has happened with this overtaking of the federal government and the infringement on our rights. This debate is not about whether or not a woman can go through the medical procedure of having an abortion. It's not what it's about. At its core, it's about who's paying for it, because they're forcing us to participate in this vile institution against our will, which is a complete infringement on everything that you started with in part 1 of the book, that this guaranteeing of civil liberties and individual rights. And this weird thing happened, to your point about unintended consequences that we talked about, is that when we respected individual freedom on the highest level, and we preserve that, it naturally brought peace between us. We recognized there was differences, but the system of preserving individual liberty allowed that to happen peacefully. What's your prediction for the future? How do you see this story going for, say, the next 25 years, or how do you see it ending? What do you see on the horizon for this country?
Wow. Well, I certainly have a point of view that I talk about in the book, which is different from what I think will happen. It's a different question. There was what I want to have happen and what I think will happen. I'm kind of an optimist. So I tend to sort of look at, I'm not super optimistic, but I tend to be more somewhat optimistic, realistically optimistic. There are things that I see that give me hope, that give me in terms of moving more into a world that fits the ideas that I talk about in this book, and I think largely you and I sort of share. I mean, I hate to say this, but the fact that Social Security is going to be insolvent, I mean, when that happens, and it's going to happen, people my age and younger are going to be like, sorry, what? I mean, right? It's like, hold up. You've been taking 15% of my money for 10, 15, 20 years, and you're telling me there's no more money. That money's gone, right? That's the kind of like, and there's no way around it. I mean, there's no way a politician can explain that. It's pretty your 7-year-old daughter will be able to understand Social Security very well. It's not a complicated problem. It's like, right, there's a money jar, it had money, money's gone, and you've been putting money in there. Like, if you did that to your daughter, she'd be really pissed, right? If you put in a year of money and then you said, hey, I'm taking the money, right? She'd be like, hey, that's my money. What happened to it? I thought you were saving it. It's like, well, I was saving it, but then we spent it. So that's going to happen. And so I think that's going to make all Americans, right, say what went wrong here. And what I think went wrong was, instead of letting Americans take care of themselves as the starting point, we said, let's let the federal government take care of it. I think everything else, and I talk about this in the book, everything else has just kind of been downhill from there, right? I mean, that was the fundamental root cause. We put 535 elected representatives in charge of an insurance program, and that's just a bad idea. Americans can take care of themselves. We have IRAs, we have 401ks, right? And, you know, a lot of people will tell you, I don't think Americans can do that, if you talk to people that disagree with this concept. And I just say, I'm sorry, but I think you haven't given them a chance, right? So that conversation will happen. And I think when people, the facts are on our side. I mean, it's going to provoke a ton of questions. What the hell happened here? Why did this happen? What else can we do? And people who are like, oh, more of the same, give us more of your money. I mean, someone's going to say, hey, like, I think younger people are going to be like, right, I don't know. Right? Yeah. But those are the people that younger people, the people who tend to vote for people that say that. So that's going to be interesting. The other thing, so I think in terms of our values being in the public realm and I think gaining currency, I think that's going to be an issue that's going to really raise issue. I think the second is, historically, at least, if you look at African Americans, even Hispanics, right, they have not been as sympathetic to these ideas as there's been large proportions that sort of are center left or left, right? That's changing.
Yes.
That's changing in a really big way. And I think that's really good, right? I know a lot of African Americans of both political persuasions, but what they're starting to say is, hey, I don't have to automatically think one way because my mom and grandparents did. I have an opinion too. And you know what? I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a free speech advocate. I'm a pro-life advocate, right? Whatever their issue might be. And they say, I don't agree with this, right? So I think we have an opportunity to actually change people's minds that before would have said, right? And you see this is a really, really big deal. So I think that makes me optimistic. Let's see if I can kind of think of anything else. I mean, I also think too, I mean, people, and I see this conversation I had. I mean, Elon Musk going to Mars, the Gates Foundation ending malaria. I mean, you look at these amazing things that make our life better. And then you look at the federal government and it's just kind of like, wah, 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 right? I mean, Elon, that's amazing. We're going to go to Mars. I mean, I think we really are. I mean, that's mind-blowing. That's amazing that that's actually going to happen, right? And I think that people are just kind of looking at, and they look at their federal government program. It's just night and day. And I think, so I think those three things combined, I think really put us in a place where we can have an adult conversation. And then I just hope that, conservatives start making a slightly different argument. Because if you say these things don't matter, you're people who are very care oriented. They care a lot. And I think we all know that some people have really big hearts. It's like, I just care. I want to help people, right? It's like, great. So do we, right? We got to turn the brain on too. We got to look at the facts. We got to look at evidence. We got to look at common sense. And we're with you on the care, but we got to think about how, right? Well, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be taking care of our most vulnerable citizens. I'm just saying I think my state government should do it.
Right. Big difference. Yeah.
Huge. And you were saying the Department of Education.
We can do it better here. Absolutely. I think a great place to start too, now that you say that, is to, pressure the state governments to start doing it. And you do see some examples of that, right? Florida stepping up big time. Texas with this busing of the migrants is just pure genius. Boy, it's amazing how quickly that's getting results. Few busloads of unwelcome guests.
Where do they go? I haven't followed this story specifically.
Oh, so the Governor Abbott there in Texas, has been complaining that the federal government's not doing enough to stop illegal immigration. And so what they've been doing at some of the processing centers there, since the executive orders have kind of they're basically just releasing these people coming across the border. So Governor Abbott has been taking them and busing them to Washington, D.C. and New York City. And it's only been going on a short time, but it's interesting how those liberal mayors are suddenly complaining.
That's very interesting.
And that's a great example.
That's worth taking a hard look at, right? I mean, I think that's a very fair thing that Governor Abbott's doing. It's like, hey, look, we're on the border here. We're the ones dealing with it. You're just running your mouth. And then we give them a small bit of the problem, right? And they're pointing fingers. It's just like, right. That's a very good.
Listen, I can understand the arguments that are made for these things, right? But just using education as an example, because it's one that touches most people. The way the taxes are collected and dispersed is not equitable in terms of every child's getting access to the same amount of financial resources. That's just not the case. The truth of the matter is that the kids in the wealthier areas are getting much more funding than otherwise, and people move around for these things. Is that fair? I guess it depends on what side of that fence you're on. There's an awful lot of money that's consumed in these things. I'm with you. I'm saying, look, we need great schools. I'm just saying, cut that waste that the Department of Education that does nothing, and bring that money back to the state and local levels the same as you. I don't understand why we can't get more politicians willing to take on that fight, because I think it's a fight that really can win. I don't know if I agree with your theory on the Social Security. That's really fascinating. I appreciate you sharing that. I definitely think it could be a big factor, but maybe the factor I would see most likely bringing us to a critical point would be that they start really charging heavily younger people with a diminishing population of younger people. Because the idea of it becoming insolvent doesn't mean that it runs out of money. It means that the trust fund portion could run out of money, and that's problematic in itself. But there will still be some revenue coming in. So there will always be something to disperse. But, you know, where we might say get 3,000 a month, you might say it was only 1,000. And on top of that, or, you know, you may get 1,500, but they're taxing young people to death to the point that they're running to Canada or Russia. And as crazy as that sounds, did you say this in the book, that there was a reduction in population? Is that a point I remember from the book?
I don't think I did. I don't think so.
Well, somewhere I read that
somewhere else. Yeah.
Yeah, that there was, so I didn't get a chance to fact check it. But during the Great Depression, there were people actually leaving, and like 100,000 people from this country migrated to Russia. And there's people talking that same way today, you know. You could tie the whole Edward Snowden thing into this, and how there's been this transformation radically, when you think about it, guy, you know, trying to protect, and whether you agree with it or not, and you know, what he did was illegal, clearly, but he's trying to say to the citizens here, you're really patriotic, and then he ends up having to seek refuge in Russia. It's kind of funny when you think about it. I'll say this, John, the book Rediscovering Republicanism, and I'll have all the links. I've been talking about it on the podcast. I think that the listeners of the podcast know how to find it. It's available on Amazon. I'll have the link down below this, and I highly recommend it. If you love our country, like I said, it's not an easy read. It's something you got to put a little time into. It's really a research document, a historical document, and I can't thank you enough. John, you know, here's the thing I think is interesting about this with your story. So you have no political ambitions. You don't even seem like it, quite frankly.
No. I mean, look, you never know, but I don't think so.
And so, but you wrote this book because you care about the country.
I think ideas matter. I think ideas matter a lot. And maybe I don't even think I'm naive. I think that's true. And, you know, they call it the Overton window. It's like, what are we even willing to consider? Like, the first thing that limits us is our imagination, our ability to envision what's possible, to understand who we are. So in this book, I was like, really, I appreciate, Chris, you're mentioning it. I mean, it is a heavy book, and I debated that. I could have made this a lot lighter, and I just said, I don't want to write a light book. I want to write a substantive book that really impacts how people look at the world. And they finished like, I'm never going to look at the world the same way.
Right.
I understand where we came from as a country. I understand why things don't work. I understand where we might be able to go that actually makes a lot of sense. And you won't look at politics the same way. So I'm just, you know, I did all the hard work to kind of put this together. And then if people are willing to do a little bit of hard work to take the read, I do think you'll never look at politics the same way.
That's a great point. I'll have to double down on that. I mean, you're right. It's a challenging read to stay up to the depth of the information in there, but the amount of work that you put into to put that out, it is a small sacrifice.
Yeah, and I was happy to do it. And yeah, I think we are kind of limited in terms of, you know, politicians aren't that, they're kind of like, what's going to work today? They don't really think it very long term. That's just kind of the nature of the job. And so this is an opportunity for someone who's not planning to run for office. I'm not writing my autobiography about how great I am and the name of my dog when I was 14 years old. I'm just telling you, you know, here's what I think the history shows, and here's what I think the facts are, and here's what I think is possible when you think big.
It's huge. I talk about this, actually tomorrow's podcast. There's a bit on here about this, the importance of everybody contributing what they can. And that's what I was getting at with this. I can't thank you enough for your contribution. The way you detailed the research in there, when I first started reading it, everything is indexed. The bibliography in the back is completely comprehensive. In other words, good luck arguing with the historical facts of that.
Yeah.
And some of that in there, a lot of it goes against contemporary academic teachings, right? And you've got the references right there. But anyway, my point in terms of your involvement in that, for me, I'm a combat veteran. My son's serving. Both my parents are in the military. I'm thinking about running. I do the podcast. Those are my contributions, right? And not everybody's going to do that. People don't want to speak in front of people. People don't have an interest in running for office. I completely get it. I said, hey, we need people to work the polls. And what you started with, like, it doesn't have to be a 25-year career commitment, but for the next election cycle, a couple, 2, 3, 4 years, go find out what's going on down there. Everybody's so reserved and they don't want to get involved. They don't want to do anything. And that's really the problem. People need to educate themselves and take action to take back control of our government. It's ours. There's no fight. We don't need a civil war. We don't need any conflict in this country. All we need to do is for people to get involved. And I think for your part in that, this contribution as a roadmap to the basic philosophy of what it means to be an American, at least in historical context, it's really fantastic, John. Before we end the interview, any last words you have?
No, this has been a pleasure, Chris. Great talking to you. Appreciate anyone listening in on this. Appreciate their reading the book. And thanks for your contributions, Chris, and having me on the show.
John, thank you.